Hey, it's Renee from the Craft Table. And it is week 3 of our summer embroidery stitch along. I hope everyone enjoyed last week's video. As you can probably tell from my background and maybe even last week's background, I am not home while I'm recording these videos. So I don't have my typical setup, and last week was a challenge trying to get everything recorded in a way that, just from my cell phone. So that was a little bit difficult. And this week is a little bit better, and I'm hoping next week will be even better. This week's stitch is the Lazy Daisy stitch. And as I mentioned, it's also known as the detached chain stitch. Next week, we will be learning the chain stitch. And I debated about whether to do the Lazy Daisy stitch first or the chain stitch first. But I really think it's easier to learn the chain stitch once you know the Lazy Daisy stitch. So after next week, then maybe you can let me know if you agree with me. I am recording this part of the video after I've already recorded the tutorial of how to stitch the stitch. Usually I do it the other way around. I talk about what I'm going to be demonstrating and then I demonstrate it. This time I did it the other way around. So after I finish talking to you right now, this little intro, I demonstrate how to do the Lazy Daisy stitch on just a scrap piece of fabric. And so I go over that, and then I kind of go over it again on the blue, on the fabric panel that I'm stitching, which is the Blue Magic fabric panel. And the reason why I did that is because the fabric panel that I'm working on doesn't really have an area that to me is specifically designed to do the Lazy Daisy stitch, if that makes sense. So I wanted to demonstrate it on on flower petals, because that is typically what I use that stitch for. So again, another rather long video that is probably longer than it needs to be, but I'd rather explain it multiple ways and multiple times so that everyone gets it, rather than not do it, just kind of breeze through it. So it's not a complicated stitch. So again, if you get bored, if you're like, I already know this, you can just speed up the video, fast forward it, whatever you want to do. Yeah, so with all those caveats being said, let's get stitching. Before I begin stitching the Lazy Daisy stitch on my fabric panel, I wanted to demonstrate the stitch on a separate piece of fabric. So I have my needle threaded and my thread is knotted, and I am going to bring my thread up to the front from the back at what I call the base of the flower petal. And I move my thread out of the way, kind of over to the left, and then I take my needle back down right where I came up. And the very first stitch, you need to be careful because there's a knot underneath there, and you don't want your you don't want your needle to go into the knot. So I take my needle down at where I came up, and then I'm going to bring it up where I want the top of my stitch to end. And then I make sure that my thread is forming a loop before I pull my needle through. And if you see, I'm doing it pretty slowly, and the key to doing this stitch is making sure that you have a circle or a loop behind your thread. And then you pull it until it makes the shape that you want. And then to finish off the stitch, you take your needle right over the loop that you just made. Can you see how the thread is on this side? And we want it to go over the top like that. So then I take my needle to the back. And that is one stitch. Another name for this stitch is the detached chain stitch. And you'll see why next week when we actually do the chain stitch, why it's called a detached chain stitch, because you're just doing one stitch by itself. So I'm going to demonstrate it again. I'm coming up from the back at the base of where I want my shape to be. In this case, it's like a flower where the petals kind of go around a circle. I pull my thread up. I tuck my thread over to the side. In this case, I'm right-handed, so I kind of put it over to the left. I put my needle back down exactly where I came up, and then I bring it up at the top of my shape. And then I want to make sure that I have my thread behind my needle, that it's forming a loop back there. If it helps, you can just tuck the thread behind the needle like that, and that way you know for sure that you will form a loop. And you see how I can sort of guide the shape with my thread as I pull it through? And then I make sure I'm taking my needle to the back over the loop. Just finish my stitch. You can also do the stitch in sort of two different steps. It's the same stitch, you're doing the same things. You're bringing your needle up, you're putting your thread off to the side, taking your needle down, but instead of bringing it right up to the top in one little rocking motion, I'm pulling it to the back. I'm not going to pull it all the way through. I'm just enough so that I have this loop formed here. And then I'm bringing my needle up at the top, making sure I have that loop, and then pulling it through. So sometimes if your thread has gotten a little short, or your needle's maybe a little too long for doing a short stitch, doing it in two different steps, you might find that easier. So I drew this circle over here, and what I want to demonstrate is how you can also fill in an area with lazy daisy stitches, even if you don't have individual little ovals in your design. So I've got a new piece of thread. I'm going to bring up my needle from the back, kind of in the center. And I'm going to imagine, and I guess I could draw this out if I wanted to, but I'm going to imagine that there's a ring full of ovals all around this circle. I'm placing my needle right where I came up, and then I'm going to make a longer stitch than I did before. So I brought my needle up where I want my stitch to end, and I'm going to pull it through. Now I want to also point out that your stitches will be much neater if you pull your needle in the direction that your stitch is going. In other words, I'm going to pull it this way, and no matter what, you want to make sure you've got that loop. So I'm pulling it this way, and I'll show you kind of the wrong way in a minute. And remember, we need to end the stitch. So I'm taking my needle down on top of that loop and pulling it to the back. So I'm going to do my next stitch kind of right next to it. So I'm bringing my needle up, putting the thread over to the side, taking my needle down, and then bringing it up kind of like right next to where I was before. And I've got the loop here. Now, what I've seen some students do is when they go to pull the thread or pull the needle, they kind of do it like this towards themselves. And you see how the loop is distorted? Just doesn't work out as nicely. So it's just much nicer if you're pulling your thread in the direction that you want your shape to go. And you can also manipulate it a little bit, you know, with your thumb. Also, you see how my thread, my shorter tail is almost catching up to the bottom, because the more I stitch, the shorter this longer one gets. So when that happens, I just gently tug on my needle a little bit and shorten up the thread. I'm not sure if I mentioned this in the earlier lesson. When you are doing your embroidery stitches, this part right here, you know, there's a lot of strain put on the thread that's right here by the eye of the needle. And that's why you don't want to start off your stitching having your thread like this, where you have one long thread, and then this little tail be really short, because you're just going to be putting so much pressure on that one little bit. Whereas if you keep the tail, that's what I call it, the tail, a little bit longer, then you're only putting stress on a little bit at a time, because then as you go along, you're going to be moving this thread. I hope that makes sense. I drew this circle on my fabric with a friction pen. So now that I'm done stitching that, all I need to do is just take my iron or a hair dryer, and the part of the circle that was not covered up with stitches will disappear. Looking at my original fabric panel that I stitched, I realized I didn't do the lazy daisy stitch in too many places on here the first time around. And that is one reason why I wanted to demonstrate how to do the stitches on here before we apply it to our panel. Right here in the middle of this heart, I did 3 lazy daisy stitches. So these orange stitches are the lazy daisy stitch. I could easily have done them on these right here. These are a good oval shape. So the petals on these little stemmed areas, I did the lazy daisy stitch there. And so I'm going to go grab the panel that I'm working on for the stitch along, and I will demonstrate this stitch a few more times. So I'm going to use thread color EZ15. And I'm going to do a detached chain stitch around each one of these. So I am bringing my needle up to the front at the bottom of the shape that I want to stitch. I'm holding my thread off to the side, and I'm taking my needle down right where I came up, being careful to avoid the knot. And then I'm bringing my needle up at the top of the shape. I'm making sure my thread is forming a loop, that it's behind my needle before I pull my needle all the way through. and making sure that I don't have my thread twisted, like so. And that is one lazy daisy stitch, one detached chain stitch. So I'm going to end my stitch by taking my needle to the back over the top of the loop. See? Now these shapes are pretty close together, so I'm not going to cut my thread. I'm just going to move on to the next shape that's closest, pulling my needle up to the front at the bottom of the shape, holding my thread over to the side, putting my needle down right where I came up, and then bringing it up at the top of the shape, making sure that my thread is behind my needle. It makes that loop that we need. And then I'm bringing my thread all the way, or my needle all the way through, and ending it by taking my needle down over that loop. Now, you can see I got a little crooked here. This is a good place to demonstrate if you messed up your stitch or you're just not happy with the way your stitch turned out. You can fix that several ways. So I'm going to take my needle out of my thread, and I'm going to use my empty needle to just pull my thread up and back to where I started my stitch, because what happened is I got my thread twisted. The loop was twisted. So all I have to do is rethread my needle and start back to where I was. So I'm to the spot where I pulled my needle up to the front, and I'm going to, I'm going to take my needle down and bring it up. My thread is forming a loop, and this time I'm going to make sure that I don't twist my thread as I pull it through. There, that's better. And I'm going to take my stitch to the back to finish it off. This time I'm going to do the stitch in 2 steps like I demonstrated before. I'm taking my needle down where I came up, but instead of coming back up in 1 step, I'm going to pull my needle to the back, but not all the way. I'm going to just pull it enough to where I only have just a little bit in the front that forms this loop. And then I'm bringing my needle up at the top of the shape, making sure it is inside the loop of thread. So both methods work. Again, let me do the 2-step method, taking my needle down at the base of the shape, pulling it to the back, but not all the way, making sure I have my loop of thread on the top, and that when I bring my needle up at the top of the shape, it is within the loop. And then finishing off the stitch by going to the back. This is the method I prefer, just doing it all in 1 step if I can. Remember on the practice piece when I said it's also best if you pull your needle in the direction that you want your shape to go. It keeps the thread smooth. So I'm going to repeat the process on this side of the leaf. And then what I think I might do, so these 3 little ovals up here are another good place to do the lazy daisy stitch. And I don't have any black thread with me. Usually what I would do is use the thread of the color of the oval, but I think what I might do is use my orange, which is the background color, and stitch those 3. So let's see what that looks like. So in this case, what I would do is maybe bring my needle up a little bit below the shape. And bring it up just a tad above the shape. And then close it. Tighten it up in such a way that it just frames that black oval. So that's just a suggestion. I didn't do that the first time, but I kind of like that. You can see I finished stitching the right side of the pink leaf with the orange. And then also the top part, I went around the black ovals in the orange thread. Before removing my hoop, I noticed that I have these 3 sets of 3 little flowers that would be great for doing the lazy daisy stitch. So I've already stitched this one. Let's stitch the middle one. So what I'm doing is I could bring my needle up here. I could do it down here, make it a little bit longer, but I think I'll just do it just maybe a little bit below the bottom part of that left petal. And you know, I said to bring your needle up at the top where you want your stitch to end, and that is true. But keep in mind that when you end your stitch, you have a little bit, the thread that goes over the loop takes up a little bit of space as well. So if you're doing a small area like this, what you might want to do is bring your needle up maybe a little bit before the top. And that way you have a little bit of extra room to work to make that top stitch going back. Now I probably could have made that a little bit tighter, but I kind of like the overlapping look. So I'm going to leave that, and I'm going to do this right petal. There we go. And then when I do the last one, which is the one in the middle, I'm going to start down here, I think. These are decisions that you can make and decide how you want your flower petals to look. And I'm putting it off to the right a little bit rather than the center. My thread's going to cover it up no matter what, but it gives me a little bit of, it spaces it out a little bit better, I think. See how I can kind of manipulate the shape by the way I move the thread? I've been stitching for a bit, so I'm going to adjust my fabric a little bit, tighten it up, pull it out, and make it a little bit tighter. So these 3 sets are spaced rather far apart, so I tied off my thread after each set. So now I'm going to do these 3, and you can tell that with these 3, you notice they're a little bit longer. The petals are. The stitch is the same. The steps are the same. It's just the stitch is going to be longer. You know, I'm bringing my needle down here. And since my thread's starting to get kind of short, I'm going to take my needle. I'm going to do the 2-step method, taking my needle down and then bringing it up. And I've got my loop right there, the thread. Now, this one's a little bit fatter. So when I pull my thread through, I'm going to just sort of take my time and not pull it quite so tight. I'm just pulling it until the shape of it matches the design underneath. For these monochromatic designs, the color thread that I am using is EZ13. I forgot to mention that. Using a light pink thread, in this case, I'm using the EZ20. I'm going to make 3 detached chain stitch, lazy daisy stitches right here. Because this fabric panel and these designs are sort of whimsical, I don't worry so much about these stitches being perfect in the sense that they exactly mimic the shape that I'm stitching around. I like adding the texture, but I'm not worrying so much about whether the shape is exactly the same. So I'm trying to decide, yeah, I think I'm going to go ahead and do this middle one next. And I'm going to start maybe just a little bit up. Can you tell where I've got my needle coming up? This is another long, thin stitch. So I'm going to pull it rather tight to make it thin. Let's see if I can zoom in a little bit. Whoops, wrong way. There we go. And now when I'm doing this far right one, I'm going to start right at the base. And I'm not sure, I might make this one a little bit thicker than the actual pink shape. We'll see. Sometimes I decide as I'm actually stitching. So I just start pulling it and then I decide, do I want it like that? Or, yeah, I think I'll make it a little bit tighter. There. I'm going to zoom in one more time there. Another spot that I chose to use the Lazy Daisy stitch are these bright pink little petals inside these purple flowers. I used the darker pink thread, Easy 21, to stitch those. And I'm not sure if you can tell, so let me zoom in. On this one right here, it's 3 Lazy Daisy stitches. And then on this one, I did the 3 Lazy Daisy stitches, but then I did a little bit of back stitching as well because I had a very thin line that I didn't think would really look good with super long petals. So that's what I did with that one. So I'm going to probably repeat that where that design is repeated throughout the panel. So like for instance, here it is over here. And can you see what I mean by the really thin line? I did the back stitch there. And I think for now, I'm gonna stop. I want to see how the overall panel looks as I add some other stitches. But some other places that I might consider doing the Lazy Daisy stitch, I could do them around these ovals. You could even do these. They're a little bit thicker, but you could do those shapes. That's repeated in different colors throughout. You have it here and here, and then back again over here. More. You could even do these little red ovals with that stitch. So tell me how you like doing the Lazy Daisy stitch compared to the back stitch. And next week we'll be discussing the chain stitch. In the meantime, I hope you have fun stitching your panel, and leave me a comment if you have any questions. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it. Share with your friends, and happy stitching.